Hello and welcome. So really glad you've been able to join us today. So Garen and I are looking forward to sharing some of what we learned when we dug into the research all around decision making. So I'm Danny. My background's organisation and people change, and I spent 6 years as Director of People and Business Services at Investors in People. And I was part of the senior leadership team that led the transition of the organisation out of the public sector and set it up as a not-for-profit in 2017. So there were loads of really interesting decisions that we had to make around that time. So I had a really broad remit in my role, so I looked after people, HR, board, governance, risk, IT, and all sorts of other things that cropped up that didn't have another home. So it was a really steep learning curve at times, but it also gave me huge scope to reimagine everything people related, not least a whole new people strategy with wellbeing at its centre. And I really enjoy seeing how decision making unfolds in organisations. It's really interesting to me to see how all the different factors come together, what gets included, who gets included, what gets left out, who gets left out. I think it's a really fascinating insight into how organisations work. So Garen, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Garrett. My profession is I'm an organisation development consultant. So organisation development is one of the sort of the three main HR disciplines, probably the least well known of them. And what we do is basically about seeing organisations as systems and optimising the way in which they work. And I do a lot of work in the area of decision making, and it is supporting leaders, leadership teams, and boards on decision management and the kind of the governance that goes behind it as well. So if you kind of had to boil it down, it's essentially making sure that organizations have the right culture for decision making, that the people making the decisions have the right authority, that you've got the right processes in place, that people are equipped with the right resources, and they're also enabled with the right skills and the right capabilities as well. And exactly what Danny's saying, an organization's success really is the sum of all the decisions that it makes, and decision making capability is such an important thing for organizations to focus on.
Brilliant, thank you. So Garen and I met nearly 3 years ago now, I think, when I engaged him to do some work with the newly formed Investors in People senior leadership team. And from that, we've just found a real shared interest and commitment to making organisations better. And we just really enjoy working together. It was one of those really good examples of in-house HR and external consultant working in partnership to make a difference in an organisation. So we'd both completed masters and found there was kind of extensive research out there that could support leaders and organisations, but we also had a shared frustration that so little of it doesn't find its way into the hands of management and HR practice. So last year we started the Distinction podcast to try and bridge that gap. And we've covered things like leadership and remote teams, optimizing team performance, and most recently decision making. The name Distinction was a nod to the idea of academic excellence and to things that really make an organization stand out, and to helping leaders and HR professionals make the distinction between myths and facts when it comes to leadership practice. And we're now working together on some joint HR project. Let me explain what we're going to cover today. So we're going to take you through a decision-making framework that we've developed on the back of our research into decision-making. It will be edited highlights as there's an awful lot of research on decision-making out there. So in this session, we're going to focus on 4 things. First up, how to categorize your decisions. Second up, how to make effective decisions. Third, how to make your decisions stick. And then at the end of the session, we're going to give you some great tools and templates that you can take away to really help improve decision-making practice, either your own or that in your organizations. We're hoping the session will give you a chance to learn a bit more about the science behind decision-making and get some hands-on practical tools to consider adopting. But we also want it to be a space for you to pause and reflect on the decisions you're making yourself or that you're supporting others with. And we'd encourage you to add questions into the chat box, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end of the session. We'll make sure everybody gets a copy of the recording, and we've got a playbook and a template document to send out as well at the end of it. So before we get into the detail, we're going to start with a quick poll. So Garen, do you want to take us through that?
Hi, yeah. So welcome, Alison. Thanks for just joining us. Yeah, so what we wanted to do is just to sort of get you out of what you've been doing this morning. So whether you've been delivering or just solving your own problems and making your own decisions, it's just to start thinking about decision making. So we just got a quick 2 questions for you. So the first question is how many cognitive biases are there that affect decision making? And the second question is, how many decisions does an organization with 50,000 employees typically make per day? So you can just put one choice in there. There's no, it's completely anonymous, so don't worry about putting a guess down if you have it. I'll just give you a moment just to put your answers down. So the answers is, for number 1, you can either go for 25, 85, 125, or 185. And then for the second question, how many decisions? It could be 100,000, a million, 4 million, or 400 million. Okay, so just got a nice spread of voting in there. Let's give you There we go. So the actual answer is there's 185 cognitive biases that affect decision making. It's quite an overwhelming number. And what we'll do today is we're going to pick out 4 of probably the most the key ones that you'll come across in day-to-day life as well. And how many decisions does an organization within 50,000 make? It's actually 400 million. Decisions per day, which is quite an astonishing number, but it just shows if an organization can dedicate resource and time into improving decision making, it can make an incredible difference to organization performance.
So one paper we read when we were doing the research on decision making described organizations as decision factories. And I think that's especially true when you work in an organization that's going through lots of change. Pretty much all of us in the last 12, 18 months or experiencing fast growth. And so many of the decisions we make or that we see have a real and direct impact on the people around us. So this session is going to be really useful to you if you're involved in decision making yourself, or you're seeing decisions being made around you where you think there's room for improvement. And we'll give you some tools as we go through to help you influence the decisions that you make and also the ones that you're seeing and part of. So first up, we're going to introduce the framework, and Garen's going to take us through the first of those 4 stages, which is the what and the why of decision making.
Great. And I think because not all decisions are equal and they all require different approaches. So there's a really nice bit of thinking by someone called Dave Snowden. And he came up with something called, I'll pronounce it as best I can, Katie, for you. It's the Cynefin model. It's a Welsh word. I've got a Welsh name, so really I should be able to pronounce it. So he came up with a really good sense-making device, and it's a way of actually sort of seeing decisions that need to be dealt with and how you then go about it. So the first thing he looked at is that some decisions are either ordered, as in, cause and effect, there is a relationship. So if the cause here, we can see the effect. So when we make a decision, we can see what the outcome is going to be. Then you've got disordered, where the relationship between cause and effect is not so clear. So we may not actually find the outcome of our decision until in hindsight. So the first one we're going to look at is the bottom right hand corner here. So the first one is it's ordered, and it's basically obvious. It's where it's just a very simple decision. Cause and effect are absolutely connected to each other, and there's a very close connection as well. So in this particular situation, what we do is we kind of sense that it's a very straightforward decision. We categorize it, and then we respond accordingly. And so when you have these kind of situations, there is one best way of doing it. So we apply best practice. And obviously, the Progress Club is predominantly sort of an HR group, so it's pretty nice to sort of give some examples in that particular domain. Yeah, sorry, Danny. So you're going to just walk us through some examples, aren't you?
Yeah, so something like annual leave approvals fall into that obvious category. There's a decision to be made, but 99% of the annual leave approvals you're faced with, you're just making the decision within predefined parameters. So you put it through the process and decide. Things like responding to routine customer complaints as well would fall into that category. There's a tried and tested best practice way of responding.
Absolutely. And so you can almost set decision-making rules, and automation can play a role as well to make efficiencies. So the next one we're looking at is in the top right. So this is complicated. So again, we can work out what the optimal solution is, but we have to do some analysis from finding the cause to actually find the best solution, or a correct solution. So with this, what we have to do is we have to sense, we analyze. So this is the domain of subject matter experts. We bring them in, they help us find the answer. And so often there's multiple ways of doing it. So rather than best practice, we apply good practice to this. And again, Danny, got some examples of that.
Yeah, so it might be something like an office relocation. It's a complicated process, but there's stages you can go through to make sure you achieve the outcome you need to achieve. Or a recruitment process. Again, you've got a process that you go through. There might be many stages, but it's relatively straightforward and some good practice to apply and follow.
Absolutely. And in a way, if you're looking at the news, the idea with the Super League, we put some analysis out this morning about the decision behind it, and they very much approached it in a complicated way. So they brought analysts in, they did the logistics of it, they looked at the financial aspects, the legal aspects, and they came up with a solution. It turns out that it was actually in the top left-hand corner, which is complex. And complex is a world that a lot of HR people actually live in. So just a little bit more about that. So with cause and effect, there's no direct relationship. In fact, often you don't know what the effect is until hindsight, after the event. So what we do then is, because we generally don't know what our solutions are going to create or our decisions are going to create, the only way we can really find out is to probe. And so when we do that, we then probe, and that can be in the form of, safe to fail experiments, some testing. And then as we start to get a better understanding of how the system is responding to our decisions, then we can then start to make some major decisions as well. And this practice is very much emergent practice. So we kind of learn it over time. So whereas complicated, it's often about getting all the right experts in the room. The complex, it's about putting as many of the stakeholders in the room together and coming up with a solution. And again, Danny, you've got some ideas there, haven't you?
Yeah, so something like culture change is definitely in that complex territory. You can kind of pull lots of different levers to affect culture change, but you never really know what the outcome is going to be and how people are going to respond and how the different things are going to work together. You kind of see that after the fact. It's pretty impossible to do something and know what the effect will be. It's much more complicated than that. And then something like leadership training and development, again, it's a more complex relationship. If only we could predict the outcome of leadership development activity, but it is much more complex because you've got so many factors involved.
Yeah, so on the surface, it should be simple. You give them their input, you choose the modules to give them. How they actually apply it and how the system responds to them is something different altogether. And then in the bottom left, we're in the area of chaos. So for those of you that were working from March through till May last year, that's very much where we were. There is no relationship between cause and effect. We just do not know what's happening. So what we often have to do is we just have to make a decision and then see what happens as a result of it. And so they call this kind of novel practice. And interestingly, you can find that an organization falls into it. So the context changes, or organizations can actually create it by design. So to actually create new ways of working. And a really good example of that is a hackathon. So we work in this way, but for 24 hours, we're going to work completely different. We're going to turn the hierarchy upside down. And then at the end of it, what happens is we go back to a new way of working, which is different to how it ever was. And again, Danny, you've got some examples of that.
Yeah, and I think we'll all be aware that, when March last year, when we had to suddenly close our offices and all start working from home, that was definitely chaotic territory. There wasn't time to sit down and plan out how it was going to work. It was a case of shutting up the office, send people home, and then work out how we make it work afterwards. Kind of a work in progress. And things like natural disasters would fall into that chaotic space as well.
Yeah, and interesting what they found is that there's the relationship between obvious and chaotic is actually that, well, there is one, which is quite surprising, and they often describe it as a cliff edge between obvious and chaotic. So we may feel as if our processes are really simple and straightforward, but when they fail, or new legislation gets introduced, or the context changes quite quickly, we then fall into chaos. And examples of that are things like, sort of legislation changes, the computer system being hacked. Danny, when we came up with this, you had one person example as well, didn't you?
Yeah, one organisation I worked with, payroll processing each month was in the obvious category. We had a defined process. We went through and it was all very straightforward until our payroll provider transferred our payroll money into another organisation's bank account, which tipped us over into chaotic really, really quickly. So we had to scrabble around and kind of work our way through that and work out how to sort it out and make sure everybody got paid.
Yeah, so it's a real example of the making sure that we don't get complacent and that we do review our processes that we have in place. We do need to make sure that we're constantly scanning the environment for new things.
So we're just going to take a short pause there just to let you kind of digest what we've talked about. And Garen, do you want to take us through the chatterfall?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's just opportunity just to use the chat box. We're just really interested to hear from you. In the past 12 months, well, let's call it 13, including March. In the past 13 months, which of the 4 categories have most of your decisions fallen into? So what we're going to do is I'm going to count to 3. So in the meantime, don't press enter just yet. Just if you want to just type in either you've spent most of your time in obvious, complicated, complex, or chaotic. I'll just give you a moment just to type your answer in the chat box. Danny, you're very welcome to put it in there as well. Okay, and when I say 1, 2, 3, okay, press it in now. Let's see where it is. So poor Alison's been in the chaotic. That's quite exhausting. Hannah, complex. Katy, everywhere except obvious. Yeah, so yeah. You actually reflect a lot of the research. So the research actually finds that the most 21st century managers actually spend most of their time balanced between the complicated and the complex. So again, it does really require us to think about how we actually make decisions. The way in which we're trained to do it may not be appropriate to the context that we're in. Thanks, guys.
Cheers, Garen. So the second part of decision making we wanted to cover was all about people dynamics. So the who of decision making. So it's pretty obvious people play a vital part in any decision making process that that takes place. And we look at people dynamics from three aspects. So first up is stakeholders. Who do you need to be involved in the decision making process? We're not going to go into any detail on that today, but we'll give you some information at the end in the playbook. And then the second element is ourselves and how we show up and impact the decision-making process. And this is a really, really interesting field of research. So we spent quite a lot of time looking at this. So Garen, do you want to tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And welcome, Sabrina, if you've just joined us. So it's really important just to be aware of what we bring to the decision-making process. There's some really interesting research by Simon and March, and they basically found that humans do something called satisfice. And by satisfy, what we mean is that we search for alternatives, but only to the point where we find an acceptable solution. So we're not searching for the perfectly optimal solution. As a result of all the decisions that we have to make every day, what we do is we just naturally take shortcuts. So we apply like heuristics or kind of rules of thumb. And most of the time, our shortcuts actually serve us well, and they save us a great deal of time. But we still often arrive at quite a good decision. But what it does is it actually means that our cognitive limitations or errors in judgment can be exposed here. And it's not because of a lack of intelligence, but simply just because we're human. So therefore, it's really important just to be aware of the bias that we actually bring to the thing. Yeah, good point, Alison, by the way. I think I'm in complete agreement with you there. So it said there's 185 biases, and we're just going to pull out a couple of them now. So the first one is called the overconfidence bias. Daniel Kahneman, we'd love to sign you post to he's a really famous thinker on this, a Nobel Prize winning researcher in the area. And he said, if I could eliminate one bias, it would be the overconfidence bias. And it's very widely experienced by the general population. Up to 80% of us are potentially culpable to this. And what it basically means is that we're often, quite over optimistic in terms of the way our expectations about things will actually happen. So, physicians are often over optimistic in their diagnosis. We keep hearing that stat that 72%, and that variable, that statistic keeps shifting, of change initiatives fail, yet we still keep embarking on these change initiatives. We're believing that our initiative will work better than the others and not necessarily taking those lessons learned on board. Also, you'll see it a lot with estimation of time. We often wildly underestimate how long something will take us.
It is, and the other area overconfidence shows up is when someone's making a decision, they will place twice as much importance on waiting on their own views and opinions on a decision than they will of the decisions from the people around them. So even if somebody intentionally goes out and gathers thoughts and views and opinions from other people, there's still that tendency as individuals to place much more importance and confidence in our own decision. So it's well worth being aware of that.
100%, yeah. The next one is the recency bias. And that's where basically we give too much weight to information we've seen, heard, or read or experienced recently. So we don't go, our data set that we look at just isn't broad enough. So, if we're making in a meeting and we're making a decision in it, we may be influenced by the last 2 or 3 conversations that we had, and that gives us a bias. Again, it's making sure that our data set actually goes back in time long enough to take those lessons learned. And a really famous example that most people know about, there's a very famous expedition up Everest in the mid-90s, and it was captured in a book called Into Thin Air, and a movie as well. And it was basically 2 tour leaders, and they were experienced, but they'd only climbed Everest in the 90s when there'd always been good weather. And when they were just at the summit, about to make the final climb, they saw that there were clouds coming in, but because they'd only experienced good weather, they went for it. Whereas other tour guides that had been coming since the 80s, when there were years and years where you just couldn't get to the peak, they were more risk averse. So again, it just shows the importance that even experienced people, if you take that data set that's more recent, it can catch you out. It would be amiss of us not to cover about intuition. It absolutely has a place. It has, very much a good place in decision making, but it's really important to understand where its optimal place is and also how it works. So if you actually look at the brain scans of people that are applying intuition, you can actually see that there's pattern recognition going on, and often it's based on matching on our past experience. So if we have a lot of past experience, it means we can really entrust our intuition, providing it's not novel. okay, that chaotic area that might mislead us. But if we have a lot of experience, it means we can actually pull on it. And it means that experts that have been around a long time can actually trust their intuition more. What Daniel Kahneman found that is a really optimal application of intuition is, rather than using it at the beginning and kind of using that kind of gut feel, and interestingly, the gut does actually respond to it from a physiological perspective. What he found is that if you do your analysis first, and then you use your intuition based on that analysis, then it often produces much better outcomes. So it's not to say don't use it, it's just to use it at the right time once it's got a proper domain to use it in as well. You know, as in HR, we work with leaders, we observe a lot of decisions being made, and maybe decisions that are working from intuition. And the challenge for leaders is always, how do you communicate that intuition to your team so you take your team with you? So Cole Veit came up with a really nice model, which is, it's a 5-step model. So this is how you share your intuition with your team. So you firstly share, here's what I think we face. This is my intuitive understanding. Here's what I think we should do based on my assessment of the situation. Here's why. So here's my rationale. So you understand it, so you can actually you know, execute my decision. Here's what we should keep our eye on. So these are some of the risks. And then once you've actually shared that intuition and the rationale behind it to allow people to follow it, then invite them to talk to you about it. So it could be in small pairs that they talk about it first and then come back to you. But what it does, it gives people an opportunity to actually start feeding into your intuition. Are you working on the right assumptions? They can ask the right questions for them to understand it. And it greatly increases the chance that people working on intuition will take their teams with them.
Brilliant, thanks. So we've looked so far briefly at stakeholders, and we've dug into our own kind of impact on decision making, and now we're going to turn our thoughts to group process. So there's lots of research out there to show that overall on average, groups tend to make better, more considered decisions than individuals, and the idea that 2 heads are better than 1 is widespread, and the research backs up that for most decisions that's the truth. But I'm sure we've all been through the pain of trying to make decisions involving a group. It can be really hard. And it brings all sorts of different risks and challenges. So if you think back to that idea of 185 cognitive biases that kind of, you know, we're all subject to, if you're then working with a group of 6 or 8, you kind of multiply that up. That's a lot of bias and challenges that you need to work through. So how can we make it feel easier? What advice can we give ourselves and our leaders to work through that? So one of the really interesting things we discovered when we were doing the research was some stats from McKinsey, and they found that the quality of dialogue is by far and away the most important factor when it comes to decision making. So it's much more important than something like the quality of analytics or kind of industry and company variables. So getting people to have really good discussions about decisions is so important, and that's where we need to really need to focus on managing group process. So what can we do? So first up, we can make sure we've got the right people involved in our decision-making process. If we've got the right people in the room, it can be really tempting to exclude those people you've got a sense are going to be a bit difficult or resistant, but you're missing a really valuable chance to miss their perspectives. And if they play any part in rolling out our decisions, then it's easier to involve them earlier rather than later. Essentially, that is that old adage that whoever needs to be involved in making the change happen needs to be invited into the conversation as early as possible. Second up is, do people know why they're involved? Are they clear on what their contribution is, what decision they're expected to make and how they play that part? You know, we've been talking recently about the idea of RACI, so that idea of responsible, accountable, contributor and informed, to identify groups. But if people aren't clear what each of those roles mean, then the tool isn't as effective as it could be. Third up, it's about really defining your problem so that everybody understands the problem they're there to solve, and that the terminology you're using is clear and understood by everyone. It sounds really obvious, but if you've got different unspoken differences in the terminology or the problem you're trying to define, then you can send your discussions and process off track before you've even started. Then it's about designing meetings and the group to really get best results. So we know from the research that what you want is to have 2 distinct phases to your decision-making process. You know, it might be a small decision that you're making in just one meeting, but break your meeting up into two distinct phases. So the first phase is looking at the information, gathering the information and making sure everybody understands the information that's in play, and then have a distinct second phase that looks at how you actually make the decision, how you evaluate the evidence, how you apply criteria. One of the biases that's really interesting to me here is something called the common knowledge effect. And that's the idea that if you bring a group of people together and they've got information that they all understand and that is common amongst them, they will spend much more time discussing the information they all they are all aware of than they will spending trying to surface the information that maybe one person in the group holds. So there might be one person in the room with a real important nugget of information that's critical to the decision, but the group will have a tendency just to discuss the things that they already share and know in common. So the other important thing around group process is helping people feel psychologically safe. You know, we don't need to teach you that. That's so important, and there's a lot of articles and information on doing that, but it really is fundamental to making sure that people can participate in a good group decision making process, that they feel able to speak up, they can ask questions, that they feel they can be open and transparent. And then lastly, it's making sure people have got space to formulate their own point of view before they're asked to get into a group discussion. So we really like the liberating structures technique, 1, 2, 4, all, and that's where you position the decision and you let people have a chance on their own to formulate their view on that decision. Then you put people in pairs so they can discuss their different perspectives. Then you bring the pairs into 4s so they can again discuss their different ideas and refine their thoughts even more. And then you bring people back to the main group, so that by that point they've had a real opportunity to work through and think about their thoughts and perspectives on the decision that's being made, rather than just kind of surprise people and go, what do you think? And then you know, depending on the individual, you're not likely to necessarily get their most considered thought. So another tool that we also really like is something called the spectrum of support, and Garen is going to take us through that.
Yeah, so it's a really straightforward tool, but that's what's really nice about it. So it's kind of sort of moving away from sort of that kind of yes no continuum. So often when it's like, do you agree with this decision or not, we ask everyone and they say yes or no. And what it does is often people can be along a spectrum in there. So yes could be anything between I absolutely love it, so to, well, actually I'm only saying yes because my boss is in the room and I daren't say no. And no could be anything between actually no, I veto this idea, to actually I don't quite understand it and I don't feel comfortable going ahead with it. So what it does is it just introducing a tool like this when you're making a decision with more than one person, it just brings a bit more language into the actual decision, and people can articulate their perspective and where they stand. And it also starts to, if people say I don't like it but I'll support it, then you can actually start to explore, so what is it, what are some of your objections that you might have, and what can we do to really amend our proposal to make sure that you're bought into it, because you do have decisions where you have to have everyone 100% agreed on it.
Yeah, and you can make that quite interactive. If you're physically in a meeting, or you've got a Miro board or a whiteboard, you can get people to actually plot their position on the spectrum visually, and give them a space to talk about it. So before we move on to the next section, we just want to finish up with one more bias that we see come into play in groups, and that's something known as the authority bias. So that's where you've got a senior authority figure, the boss, the leader, in the room, and others perceive that individual as having more wisdom, confidence, gravitas, or just authority, and they tend to dominate decision making, and decisions are often made by deferring to them, even if the boss thinks they've created a really open, transparent environment. It's interesting how just the very fact that you've got a senior leader in the room will affect how the discussion.
Everything.
Yeah, it does change everything. It's also, I've also heard it described as the hippo effect, the highest paid person's opinion. And there was a really nice study at the Rotterdam School of Management, and they found that projects led by junior managers had a higher success rate than those that were led by senior managers. And that was found to be because employees were more comfortable sharing their opinions, challenging assumptions, giving honest feedback when the projects were being led by junior managers. When it's senior managers, that authority bias kicks in and people feel much more reluctant to speak up and believe that the senior leader, the authority figure, obviously knows what they're talking about and is going to be right. Brilliant. So just another pause after that section. There's no need to add anything to chat or write anything down, but we're just really interested in knowing what bias you see most often in the workplace. Which one of those ones that we've talked about rings most true for you? Is it something like the recency effect or authority bias, overconfidence, common knowledge, groupthink, or is there something else? So now we're on to tools and techniques. So we're going to get super practical, and Garen's going to take us through this section.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes with decision making, it's very easy to get very theoretical, but let's give you some practical tools you can implement. I'm just hitting enter in the chat box now. So all of this is in a playbook that we're going to share with you. So we've just put our email address in there. Just drop us a line saying, yes, I'd like to receive it, and then we'll send you a copy afterwards. So what we're going to do is just share with you 5 easy to implement practical tools. And a lot of it is focused on enhancing that 53% of dialogue that's critical to decision making. So as we sort of just started to allude to a little bit earlier, is just the how often when teams or people are making decisions, it's just the lack of options that are given with these proposals. It's literally a binary choice. I think it was 71% of decisions in organizations are binary choices, and that's literally yes, are we going to do it or not? So therefore come with options. It really expands the thinking. And just to help your thinking, here are 5 potential options for you to consider. So the first one is, okay, we're going to go with the decision. Actually, do you know what? We're going to double down on the decision. We're going to go really big on it. This is what if we really do put a big bet on this. Another one is we are going to do it. We're going to delay it. We're going to delay it by, I don't know, 3 months, 6 months, 12 months. And this is what we're going to do as a result. Again, it just opens up a little bit more thinking. And option 3 is like, we could just go with like, we're just going to abandon it and we're going to just go down a different path altogether. Again, it helps people understand what the opportunity cost is of these decisions that we're making. We just often, just because such an action orientated bias in organizations, we just go straight down the path. Another one is multiple vendors. So we'll ask for 2, 3, 4 vendors. Normally the best one is 3. We get a difference of choices, and even the one that we go with, we can actually bring in some of the ideas from the other vendors into the final solution. And you came up with another one there, didn't you? Adjacent possibility.
Yeah, so that's the idea of next adjacent possibility. So we don't need to go for, you know, a really wild and radical next big idea. You look at an organization like Amazon, they didn't go from, you know, where they started selling books to the kind of being the giant they are now. They started with books and then they made tiny steps to kind of build and expand on what they did over time. So always look at the kind of next adjacent. What's the one small change, or what's the thing in the next square that we could do that's slightly different to the option we're considering?
So another one is decision tree. So I sit in a lot of meetings and I observe decisions being made. And one of the things I sit in a lot on is board meetings. And being a board member is really difficult. You meet quarterly, you get given papers, you don't work in the organization, and all of a sudden you're given these massive strategic decisions to be made. And literally people, sometimes papers are done, but they're just narrative. So what's missing often is actually just working up the detail. So, you know, what do these different options look like? And a decision tree is a really nice model for doing it. For most decisions, it works really well. So we've just put a couple of worked examples here. So this is a relocation. So what we do is we just work through what option 1 might look like for a relocation. So in this new hybrid way of working, we downsize, we move to another premises. This is what a 12-month lease looks like. This is what happens if we extend it. Option 2, and it's actually putting some financial numbers on it based on probability, which again is just something, it's fairly straightforward, but can have a huge positive impact on decision making when you just bring in some very basic probability. Again, it just really helps people feel informed when they make a decision. The next one is trade-off analysis. I think one of the things that people forget is that all decisions are trade-offs, and therefore it's really important to identify what are the trade-offs and what is the key criteria that we make our decisions based around. So a trade-off analysis is a really nice dialogical tool. So the first thing we do is we just identify what's the key criteria upon which we'll base our decision. So again, for this relocation, it looks at things like, location and whatnot as well. So once we've actually identified our criteria, we then put a score against it, because not all criteria are the same. And again, Danny, you've sort of experienced that as a director in organizations.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, particularly when you get a group of functional heads together, it can be really difficult to identify the criteria and weight the criteria. You know, if you get a marketing person in the room and a finance person in the room and an HR person in the room, they all have the feeling that their area of the business should be the most important criteria and the most heavily weighted, or they decide to dodge it completely and we'll go all criteria are equal. So it's really important, if you're leading a process like this, not to let the group off the hook and really push them to have a discussion about what are the most important criteria that are going to contribute to the organization's overall goals, because you can't make everything equal, otherwise it's a largely pointless process.
Yeah, and this is the work. This is the bit where you're getting buy-in, because people have been very explicit in terms of what are the most important things upon which we'll make our decision and which aren't. So the next thing you do is, once you put weighted importance next to it, is you then score your 3 different options, for example, that you've done. And what you get is an arbitrary number. So again, after that, you can then apply your intuition and to go with it. And you're moving ever closer to a decision, but with a much more informed, and you also know where people stand as well. Again, another thing that when groups of people come together to make decisions, and individuals as well, is to actually think, okay, so we often make a decision based on now, but we don't necessarily think about the implicative effect of our decisions. What will happen in 3, 6, 12 months, 18 months as a result of this decision? So a really nice simple table called the PMI, so PMI stands for plus minus implications, is a way of working through that. And what it does, it invites people to work through each of the individual options, and to actually identify the plus points of it, the minuses, and the implications of it as well. And so then what you're able to do is then you give them a score, and then you total it up, and then your option has a score, then your other options have a score. And again, what it does, it just means it's much more informed, and it moves it a little bit more towards objectivity rather than subjectivity as well. So yeah, so one of the things we talked about was complexity. And so cause and effect, we generally don't know what the relationship is. So when we start to make decisions and we don't know what the outcome is going to be, rather than making a big bet decision, is we start to run small experiments. So these are small, safe to fail experiments, which are low risk. So the way in which we do it is we develop a hypothesis. So this is what we believe to be the right way forward. And then we run experiments. So if you're in the HR world, there's a whole range of things you can do to just see if that decision will work. It could be surveys, focus groups, landing pages, A/B testing, pilots, and it's endless. And product management and agile management have done quite a lot. Agile project management have done quite a lot of work in actually sort of forming how experiments can work. So then when you've done your experiment, then you start to develop some evidence, which then provides insight. And then so when you take action, then that can actually start to move you forward as well with a lot more confidence.
Thank you. So that's the end of the tools and techniques section. So just before we go into the final section, we're going to do one last chatterful. So we're really interested in what decision-making tools have you found useful in your work. So we've shared some of those, and there's other things like the Pareto analysis, De Bono's 6 hats, force field analysis. So if you fancy putting into chat whenever you're ready, the tools that you think have really helped you, it would be great to share those with the group.
And I've actually known leadership teams use things like scissors, stone, paper as a as a decision making. So I'm not quite sure what the academic research is on that, but okay, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so yeah, 6 hats is an all-time classic. Hannah, you've used trade-off analysis, which is wonderful. Be very interested to see how you found that as a tool. So brilliant. So some really nice experiences. And again, it's we really encourage you to sort of share your own insights from using these tools as well. So we're not encouraging you to use all of the tools. We're just sort of saying use them according to the situation. Thanks, Katie. It says here that Katie has actually used rock, scissors, paper. We'll ask about how happy she was with her purchase afterwards.
Brilliant. So so we've made that decision, and then it's really what's next. So this is potentially the most tricky part, and it's about getting your decision implemented and having it take root. So all the effort you put into making a really good decision can be wasted if you don't give enough thought to deciding how you're going to roll out your decision. And as leaders, we have to not only make good decisions, we also have to be able to implement them effectively. And the process we use to make decisions often has a really great impact on whether we're going to be able to do that. So there was some recent CIPD research that found that the perceived fairness, consistency, accuracy, and openness of decision making was really strongly associated with employee commitment and identification with their organisation. And it was also a predictor of how much discretionary effort employees put in, and it influenced things like staff turnover, job satisfaction, employee well-being, and attitude. So there's some really solid reasons there why you should pay good attention to decision making and having a solid process. So we've got kind of a 7-step process to communicating decisions effectively. And first up is a really obvious one, but easy to forget. It's share the rationale for your decision and help people understand how it fits into the bigger organizational picture. Second up, it's explaining the process you've gone through and showing what they call procedural justice. So procedural justice comes up a lot in the research, and it's a really important thing. And it's about the fairness and transparency of the process you've used to reach a decision. And there's 2 things we need to pay attention to. So first up, did you use a fair and transparent process? So if people perceive that the decision was preordained or believe the process you ran was just an exercise in paying lip service to consultation and collaboration, and we've all been there kind of on the end of that and we know how that feels, then people are obviously a lot less likely to buy in decisions. Second up, related to procedural justice, is do people perceive the process was fair and just? So you can have a beautifully transparent and fair process, but if people don't understand how you went about the process, who was involved, how the decisions were made, then they won't necessarily see it as fair. And I think that's especially important if you're working in an organisation with a history of, sketchy decision making that hasn't always been fair and consistent, then you're going to have to work much harder to change people's ideas and perceptions of the process. Then third up, we'll try and do is we show the benefits of the decision, so people understand what's changing and how it's going to be good for them. But the flip of that is also explain to people what's not changing. When you've got a lot of change happening, if you can say to people, X is changing, but Y, Z, A, B, C, and D are all staying the same, then that really helps reassure people and ground people, and they can be much more open to dealing with the changes that are being prompted by the one thing that's changing.
Right. And so, yeah, so building on that, I think so much effort goes into the quality of decisions, but not so much on the acceptance of decisions. So I think one of the things that's really important for people that are making decisions, that are rolling them out, is to be really open about the trade-offs and the downsides of decisions that are made. So, if we take one example, which is our organization restructure, they're often oversold to organizations. This will fix the organization. All organization restructures are trade-offs. There's no optimal structure. And people will find the downsides, but they'll find the downsides by talking to each other and talking at the coffee machine or over WhatsApp. So it's better to just talk about them openly and engage people and say, okay, these are the downsides. What can we do to negate them and deal with them as well? And we understand this is going to be difficult, and being really explicit and engaging people in an adult conversation. Also helping people understand what it means for them. So to actually sit down and say that this is what your reality is going to change as a result. So this is how your priorities might change, or this is how you might have to allocate your resources. So if we can actually help people do that, then they can actually start to understand how they'll need to act differently as a result. And also what it does is it means that we get a feedback of information. It might be that when we're sitting down with someone and they're saying, well, actually, it's going to impact this and I can't do that. All of a sudden, this is new information for you that you didn't have before, and you can update your decision and maybe sequence the activities differently. Also, we've all seen lots of decisions in organizations, and often the narrative is, if we can keep our head down, this will pass. This will become a fad, with all the other fads that we've had before as well. So it's really important for a manager or a decision maker to keep paying attention to it. Put a plan in place, put a structure in place, be clear, set performance measures, keep to the timelines, be clear on accountabilities. You must track progress. The Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, basically says that, when there's an important decision to be made, he makes everyone have a meeting every day to discuss it, because it makes people understand it's such an important issue. Keep engaging with other stakeholders and managers to keep track of the decision, and making sure that the decision you made, the criteria on, is still the same as well. And then lastly, and really importantly, is to review it and to get feedback and to actually review your decision-making process. And also, that we can make sure that next time we make a decision, we can actually feed into it and make sure that we're taking our lessons learned from it as well.
Great, thank you very much, Garen. So we're on the home stretch now, so just some final thoughts. So that's the 4 phases of our framework. So we'll just do a quick recap on that. First up was the what and the why. That's all about the context and categorizing the decision you're making. The second phase was all about the who, so the people side of decision-making, stakeholders, ourselves, and groups. Then we did a section all about the how of decision-making, so some tools and processes you can use to help improve decision-making. And then we've talked about the what next side of decision-making, how you can actually make your decisions at work, come to life, get communicated, and bring them to life. So the main aim of this session was to give you some really practical tools to take away. We've covered a lot of ground, and there's no expectation you tackle it all at once. It's definitely not about adopting everything that we talked about in one go. Our advice would be to meet people where they currently are, and find small but effective ways to get people thinking more deliberately about their decision making. If you can get them just to pause and think about how they're making a decision, then that's a really good step. And then as interest grows and people can see the benefits, you can build on that as we go along. So there's all sorts of ways that you can support decision making in your organization. We've put up some ideas that we've worked with organizations to improve their decision making. So I don't know if you wanted to pick a couple out there, Garen, that you particularly like.
Yeah, well, we're going to go into Q&A in a moment, so feel free if anyone's got any questions. That I guess one of the things that I was thinking about is one-to-one coaching can be a really useful tool. Something when we may not be allocated as the coach to the person, but we can help coach people to better decisions. So, for example, if you're working with someone, or you can see that they're making a decision, and they're going with the yes, no, like there's only one option on the table, you can ask coaching questions and ask very simple questions like, what else have you considered? And they may not have anything, but then that encourages them to think of something else. And then if they say, then you say, and what else have you considered? And all of a sudden, by asking some very open and gentle coaching questions, you're getting people to think through the options and the implications of what they're actually going to be deciding on. I guess another one there is you can often see teams or departments or individuals making decisions, but they're making them in a siloed perspective, particularly in remote or hybrid working. So they're making a decision around their own world, and it makes complete sense, but they're not looking down the process. So there's someone maybe 2 steps down that's going to be really badly affected by it. So it is about, being brave and facilitating conversations between different parties and saying, they're making a decision over here. It's really worthwhile you coming together and having a discussion about this as well. And that can have a huge positive impact.
Yeah, one I always encourage clients to look at is reading organizational strategies and business plans. It's surprising how many organizations and people don't know what their organizational strategy is. So having a look at that and seeing what decisions are likely to be coming up that need to be made, or are there decisions that aren't clearly articulated? So just doing that piece of background research can really help get people thinking about what decisions are coming up. As we promised you, we've got 2 things that we're going to share with you after this session. So the first up's our decision-making playbook, which takes you through the model and gives you templates. And there's a real hands-on decision-making toolkit with kind of Excel versions of some of the tools we've talked about. So if you want either of those or both of them, then you just need to email us at hello@distinction.live and we'll make sure you get a copy. We talked a bit about our podcasts. So, we host the Distinction podcast, and you can access those on YouTube or via our website. So once we send you this slide deck, and again in the play deck, there's links to those. So if you want to hear the full podcast on decision making, you can dive into that, or the one we did about leaders and remote work or effective teams. And then there's just ways to contact us. So you're welcome to connect with either of or both of us on LinkedIn. We post pretty frequently on all sorts of topics, so we're always delighted to have more connections that way. So we're on to Q&A. Have there been any questions come up in the chat while we've been talking, Garen?
Because obviously you were a director in HR. You're not always directly involved in decisions that are being made, but you can see them being made or considered.
Yes.
What ideas do you have for influencing this decision making of others?
I think there's all sorts of ways you can deploy to kind of get yourself into a position where you can support people with decision making. So I think it's about building really strong, close relationships with decision makers, and get yourself, offer yourself up as a sounding board so they know you're there to help them work through decisions, whether they're people related or not, because very often a decision might not look like it's directly got a people or HR aspect, but very often it does when you dig into it. So if you can offer yourself up as a sounding board, I think just keep an eye on, key people's diaries. What meetings have they got coming up that it might be useful to have a chat to them about when you bump into them in the coffee area or next time you're having a one-to-one. So those would be a couple.
Great. Some of those are the dark arts of HR, aren't they, in order to to position yourself and use the recency effect to your advantage as well. Great. Yeah, just looking in the chat box, what advice do you have if people you work with are reluctant to change how they approach decisions? So it might be that they've got, overconfidence bias, for example.
Yeah, I think, there's lots of different tactics, but I think partly it's role modeling good decision making practice yourself, so they can pick up that. I think having tools and templates on hand can be really useful as well. So if you can show it's going to help them do their job better or do their job more effectively, then that could be really powerful as well.
Brilliant. Great. And great points, Anthony. So what about cultural in general? Some cultures in different regions rely on different methods. Yes. I yeah, absolutely, with Scandinavia, really interesting study by a guy called Hofstede. It was commissioned by IBM, and that looked at the individual and collective cultures. I actually worked as a consultant in China, which is a fascinating place to work within organizations, and a lot of it's working with American companies. So individually orientated Western organizations working with collective organizations, and a completely different approach to decision making as well. It absolutely does have an impact. So if you work for an international global company, but you work for it in Swindon, then it's just as important to understand the global culture as it is that your local operating culture as well.
Yeah, it's one of the things we dig into on the podcast, isn't it? The impact of culture on the decision-making process, and people really need to take time to understand the culture they're operating in before they go forward with the decision-making process.
Yeah, and Anthony's just added that he's actually in Norway. Yeah, a lot of the practices that we actually encourage with organisations comes from a lot of sort of Scandinavian systemic thinkers. They're really advanced with their thinking in terms of how to really bring organisations together. So yeah, great point, Anthony.
Fabulous. Well, thank you very much for inviting us to share our thoughts and insights. It's been great, and some really good engagement and participation on the chat. So thank you.
Great, thanks guys. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll speak to you soon.